The year was 1855, and the sun hung low over the dusty town of Calamity Creek, casting long shadows that danced on the weathered wooden buildings. The town was no stranger to visitors, but the man who staggered into town that evening was different. He was tall, with a lean build, and his clothes, though similar to the typical attire of a drifter, had an odd, almost metallic sheen to them. His face was gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the fading light, and his movements were stiff, as if every step caused him pain. He stumbled down the main street, clutching his side, where dark, viscous fluid seeped through his shirt. The few townsfolk who noticed him quickly averted their eyes, assuming him to be just another injured soul from some skirmish or brawl. But there was something about him, something strange. He passed the saloon where laughter and the clinking of glasses spilled out into the street. The man paused, his eyes narrowing as he peered through the swinging doors. He saw two men at the bar, deep in conversation, and behind them, hanging on a wall, were two revolvers. The man's eyes locked onto the weapons, and for a moment a flicker of curiosity crossed his face. Inside the saloon, the two men continued their animated discussion, oblivious to the stranger who had just entered. They were in the midst of what looked like a heated debate, their hands gesturing wildly when the stranger approached. His presence went unnoticed until he was mere feet away, and when he spoke, their conversation abruptly halted. "Excuse me, gentlemen," the stranger said, his voice a bizarre mix of tones, sounding almost like multiple voices speaking in unison. The men turned to him, eyebrows raised in confusion. "I couldn't help but notice your weapons." The men exchanged a glance. The way the stranger spoke was odd, his words too precise, too formal, and his accent was unlike anything they had ever heard. Yeah?" one of the men replied cautiously. "What about 'em?" The stranger pointed to the revolvers on the wall. "May I examine them?" The men chuckled, thinking the stranger was maybe a bit touched in the head. "Sure, if you've got the coin to buy 'em," one of them said, smirking. The stranger tilted his head, clearly not understanding the joke, but he stepped forward and reached for one of the revolvers. His hand hovered over it for a moment, as if he was assessing the weight and balance without even touching it. Then he grasped the handle and lifted it from the wall. The men watched, bemused, as the stranger turned the revolver over in his hands, his expression one of deep concentration. He seemed fascinated by the simple mechanics of the weapon, running his fingers along the barrel and trigger with an almost reverent touch. "This is interesting," the stranger muttered, more to himself than to the men. "Primitive, yet effective." The men exchanged another glance, this one tinged with unease. "You gonna buy that or just fondle it all night?" one of them asked, his tone growing impatient. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he suddenly turned and walked out of the saloon, the revolver still in hand. The men shouted after him, but he didn't stop. He stepped back into the twilight, his eyes scanning the street as if searching for something. He raised the revolver, his eyes narrowing as he aimed at a distant target, a small, rusted signpost at the end of the street. He squeezed the trigger, and the revolver bucked in his hand, the sound of the shot echoing through the quiet town. The stranger's eyes widened as the signpost quivered but remained intact. He fired again, this time aiming at a stray piece of wood on the ground. The wood splintered, and the stranger's lips curved into what could only be described as a smile. The sensation of the weapon in his hand, the recoil, the sound, it was exhilarating. He fired again and again, each shot more frantic than the last. The noise drew the attention of the townsfolk, who emerged from their homes and shops, staring in shock at the stranger who was now wildly firing down the main street. The sheriff, a burly man with a thick mustache and a no-nonsense demeanor, was the first to react. What in tarnation is going on here? Sheriff Ezekiel Zeke Thompson bellowed as he stormed down the street, his own revolver drawn. The stranger finally stopped firing, lowering the revolver as he turned to face the sheriff. His expression was one of pure exhilaration, though it quickly faded when he saw the look on the sheriff's face. "What do you think you're doing, son?" Sheriff Zeke demanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had kept Calamity Creek in line for years. The stranger blinked, his excitement dampened by the sheriff's stern gaze. He looked down at the revolver in his hand, then back at the sheriff, as if trying to understand what he had done wrong. "I was testing," he said, his voice still carrying that odd, multi-tonal quality. "This device, it's—" "Testing?" Zeke interrupted, his mustache bristling with irritation. "You almost gave half the town a heart attack, not to mention the damage you could have done with that wild shooting. Hand it over." The stranger hesitated, his fingers tightening around the revolver. But the sheriff's eyes were unyielding, and after a moment the stranger sighed, a sound that seemed to resonate with more than just the usual weariness, and handed the weapon over. Zeke took the revolver and quickly checked the chamber, his practiced hands moving with the ease of years spent handling firearms. "You're lucky you didn't hit anyone," he muttered, his tone softening slightly as he noticed something odd. "Huh? Not a single round left in here, but no one's hurt. Just a few dead crows. And rats?" He looked up at the stranger, curiosity mingling with suspicion in his eyes. "You've got some remarkable aim, fella. How'd you manage that?" The stranger's expression was difficult to read, but there was a hint of pride in his voice as he replied, "I calibrated the trajectory, adjusted for wind resistance and gravitational pull. Simple physics." Zeke stared at him, his brow furrowing. "Simple physics, huh? You some kind of scientist?" The stranger hesitated, then nodded, though the motion seemed unsure. "You could say that. My studies are varied." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press further. Instead, he holstered his own revolver and gestured for the stranger to follow. "Come with me. We need to have a little chat." As they walked toward the sheriff's office, the townspeople watched with a mix of curiosity and wariness. The stranger kept his head down, aware of the stares but not fully understanding them. He had been on this planet long enough to know he had to blend in, but every interaction reminded him just how different he was. Inside the office, Zeke gestured for the stranger to take a seat. The room was sparse, with a desk cluttered with paperwork, a few wanted posters on the walls, and a single cell in the back, its iron bars casting long shadows in the dim light. "Now," Zeke began, leaning against the desk with his arms crossed, "I don't know where you're from, but it's clear you ain't from around here. You talk like you've got a head full of books, but you handle a gun like you've never seen one before today. What's your story?" The stranger looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the wanted posters. Each one depicted a rough-looking outlaw, their crimes listed in bold letters beneath their grim faces. He seemed to consider his words carefully before speaking. "I am a traveler," he said slowly, "from far away. I've been stranded here, trying to adapt, to understand your people and your ways." Zeke raised an eyebrow. "Stranded, you say? How'd that happen?" The stranger hesitated again, then sighed. "My vessel, it was damaged in a storm. I crash-landed, and I've been trying to repair it, but the materials I need are not available here." The sheriff nodded slowly, though he clearly didn't fully grasp what the stranger was saying. "And what about that shooting spree you just went on? What was that about?" The stranger's eyes lit up with that same odd excitement. "Your weapons, they're fascinating. So simple, so tactile. On my world, our technology is far more advanced, but it lacks the physicality of your devices, the sensation of holding it, the force of the recoil, the need to aim. It's also real. Zeke couldn't help but chuckle, though he quickly stifled it. You're a strange one, all right, but I'll admit, you've got a talent, and we could use someone like you around here. The stranger looked up, surprised. What do you mean? The sheriff motioned to the wanted posters. We got our fair share of troublemakers in these parts. Outlaws, bandits, rustlers, you name it. And the way you handled that gun, well, you could be useful. I could deputize you, have you help me keep the peace. You'd get paid, and you'd have a roof over your head. The sheriff studied the stranger's face, waiting for a response. The room was thick with the scent of leather, dust, and the faint, acrid smell of gunpowder. The stranger, for his part, seemed to be lost in thought, his eyes flitting from one wanted poster to the next, absorbing the faces of the lawless men and women who had carved their names into the annals of local infamy. Finally, the stranger spoke. Clayton Brooks, he said, testing the name as if it were a foreign object in his mouth. That's what you can call me. Clayton Brooks, eh? Sheriff Zeke scratched his chin, the name rolling off his tongue as if trying it on for size. All right, Clayton. What's it gonna be? You want to be my deputy, help me keep the peace. Clayton tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered the sheriff's offer. I appreciate the opportunity, Sheriff, but I think I'd prefer to try something else. I've seen how your people live your towns, your customs, and I'm curious. I want to experience more of this world, to travel, to immerse myself in your culture, and I think being a bounty hunter would allow me to do just that. Zeke blinked, taken aback by the unexpected response. A bounty hunter? You sure about that, son? It ain't exactly an easy life. You'll be out there on your own, facing all sorts of dangers. Wild animals, treacherous terrain, and some of the meanest, deadliest outlaws this side of the Mississippi. Clayton's eyes gleamed with excitement. Precisely. I want to see it all. I want to ride one of your horses, learn to navigate your land, understand your people's resilience in the face of danger. This world is raw, untamed. I want to experience that. The sheriff chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. You're either the bravest or the craziest fella I've ever met, Clayton. But if that's what you want, who am I to stop you? Zeke stood up and led Clayton to a wall in the back of the office. It was covered in posters, each one depicting a different outlaw, their crimes listed beneath their names in bold, angry letters. Hundreds of faces stared back at them, some sneering, some grim, some with cold, dead eyes that sent a shiver down even the sheriff's spine. Here's where you'll find your future if you're serious about this bounty hunting business, Zeke said, gesturing to the wall. Pick a name, bring 'em in, and you'll get your reward. But be warned, some of these men are as dangerous as they come. You'll need more than just good aim to survive out there. Clayton's eyes roamed over the posters, taking in the names and faces of the wanted men and women. He could sense the weight of the sheriff's words, but it only fueled his determination. These were the people who had mastered the harsh conditions of this world, who had defied the law and lived outside the bounds of civilization. They were exactly the kind of individuals Clayton wanted to understand. Then, one poster caught his eye, a name in bold letters that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Mad Dog Cletus Buck. Who's that? Clayton asked, pointing to the poster. Zeke's expression darkened as he glanced at the poster. The face on the paper was that of a man in his late 40s, with a wild mane of hair, a crooked nose, and eyes that seemed to bore into your soul. His mouth was twisted into a sneer, and even in the crude drawing, there was an unmistakable aura of menace. Mad Dog Cletus Buck, the sheriff said, his voice low. The meanest, deadliest outlaw these parts have ever seen. He's a legend, and not in a good way. Robbed more banks, held up more stagecoaches, and spilled more blood than any 10 outlaws combined. They say he's as cunning as a fox and as ruthless as a rattlesnake. Clayton studied the poster, intrigued. His arrival was similar to mine? Zeke nodded, his eyes never leaving the poster. Yeah. No one knows where he came from. Just showed up one day, started raising hell. Folks say he's got a way about him, like he's not quite right. Some even say he ain't human, but that's just talk. All I know is, no one's ever come close to bringing him in, and those who've tried, well, they didn't live to tell the tale. The sheriff turned to Clayton, his expression serious. If you're thinking about going after him, you'd better think twice. Cletus Buck is the real deal. Clayton stared at the wanted poster for a long moment, tracing the outline of Mad Dog Cletus Buck's face with his eyes. The challenge was irresistible. The idea of facing an outlaw who might share his origins was too intriguing to pass up. "I'll take the bounty," Clayton finally said, his voice firm. Sheriff Zeke raised an eyebrow, a mix of surprise and concern flickering across his weathered face. "You sure about that, Clayton? Like I said, Cletus Buck ain't just any outlaw. He's the worst of the worst." Clayton nodded, his determination unwavering. "I'm sure. If I'm going to learn what I need to survive in this world, I might as well start with the biggest challenge." Zeke sighed, shaking his head. "All right then. But you'll need a horse first." The sheriff led Clayton out to the town's small stable, where a few tired-looking horses were resting. Zeke called over the stable hand, a wiry young man with a straw hat perched low over his eyes. "You think you can saddle up a horse for our new friend here?" Zeke asked. The stable hand nodded, quickly preparing a sturdy bay mare. The horse snorted as Clayton approached, tossing its head as if sensing that its new rider was anything but experienced. Clayton watched the stable hand carefully, mimicking his actions as he mounted the horse. It was clear from the start that the alien had no idea what he was doing. His movements were awkward, and he nearly fell off as he swung his leg over the saddle. But eventually, he managed to stay seated, albeit in a very unorthodox position, lying nearly flat against the horse's neck, his arms wrapped around it as if he were hanging on for dear life. Zeke and the few townsfolk who had gathered to watch this spectacle exchanged bewildered glances. The sheriff's deputy, a lanky man with a permanent scowl, leaned over and whispered, "You think that fella's gonna make it?" Zeke scratched his head, his eyes narrowing as he watched Clayton cling to the horse in a way no one had ever seen before. "Well, if he can find his way out of town without falling off that horse, I'll be amazed. I'd be even more surprised if that horse don't come trotting back here on its own, without him." The townsfolk chuckled, but Clayton ignored them, his focus entirely on the task at hand. He nudged the horse forward, and to everyone's amazement, the mare began to trot down the street, albeit at a slow and unsteady pace. Clayton's face was a mask of concentration as he tried to steer, his head barely visible over the horse's mane. As the horse picked up speed, Clayton's grip tightened. He couldn't see much from his prone position, but he trusted the animal's instincts to guide them. The townsfolk watched in bewilderment as the mare and its strange rider made their way out of town, teetering slightly, but somehow managing to stay on course. "Well, I'll be damned," Zeke muttered under his breath as he watched Clayton disappear over the horizon. "Maybe he's got more grit in him than I thought." The deputy snorted. "Or more luck. That's a sight I'll never forget." Clayton's journey into the wilderness was anything but graceful. He struggled to maintain his balance, his legs flailing occasionally as the horse navigated the rocky terrain. He was grateful that no one could see the awkward spectacle he was making. But despite the rough start, Clayton's determination never wavered. He knew that somewhere out there, Mad Dog Cletus Buck was waiting, and he was determined to find him. Hours passed. the sun beginning its descent as Clayton rode further into the wild. The endless landscape of rolling hills and jagged rocks stretched out before him, a maze of potential hiding spots for a man like Cletus. Clayton relied on a combination of observation and intuition, alien instincts honed from years of survival on distant worlds, to guide him. As dusk settled in, Clayton spotted a faint trail of smoke rising in the distance, near a cluster of boulders that looked like the perfect place for an outlaw to hole up. He guided the horse toward the smoke, his heart pounding with anticipation. As he drew closer, he dismounted, falling rather than dismounting gracefully, and crept toward the source of the smoke, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a small campfire flickering against the darkening sky. Sitting by the fire was a man who matched the description on the wanted poster almost perfectly. Wild hair, crooked nose, and those same cold, piercing eyes. But as Clayton got closer, something strange happened. He felt a connection, a sense of familiarity that went beyond mere recognition. This man wasn't just another human outlaw. He was something more, something alien. Cletus Buck looked up sharply, wondering how anyone had gotten so close to him. This was a first. No one had done that before. "Hold it right there. Not one more step, or I will unload all of these primitive lead bullets into you." Clayton could not believe his eyes. It was his old friend from the planet Zartuek 2 Prime, who was the very reason he crashed on Earth looking for him. Both aliens were looking at each other with stalled expressions, waiting for the other to speak.